Hello Fire These Times listeners. My name is Ayman Makarem, and as you may have heard, the Fire These Times is expanding. And with that, we're releasing and developing new projects and podcasts that we hope you'd enjoy. One of which is my new podcast, Politically Depressed, which is a weekly blog-style podcast about being depressed in times of political, economic, ecological collapse, etc., etc. I've already released the first 4 episodes, but we thought it'd be a good idea to make one longer compilation episode and release it on the main feed here on the Fire These Times. The length comes out to about the same as a usual Fire These Times podcast episode, and we'll be providing the time code in the description of this episode so you can navigate it better. The first episode is entitled Introductions, and I think it does an okay job of introducing the concept and the vibe of this podcast, so I'll let it speak for itself. I really hope you enjoy my new podcast, and if you do, you can follow it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere that you get your podcasts. And of course, if you appreciate it even more, head over to patreon.com/firethesetimes and make a monthly donation of as little as $5 a month to support us as we grow and release new content from the periphery for you. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Politically Depressed. I'm your host, Ayman Makarem, and in this very first episode, I want to briefly go through why I've decided to make a podcast and what this podcast even is to begin with. So, from the title, I think it's pretty obvious that this is going to be a very political podcast, but also a podcast that involves itself a lot with issues of quote-unquote mental health. I don't like the term. I'll definitely talk about it much more later on, especially because it's so much more all-encompassing than what mental health as a kind of exclusive thing suggests. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. I want to make a podcast exploring and talking about why we are all so incredibly depressed. Everybody I know is on antidepressants. Everyone I know is not just in therapy, but is frustrated with their therapist and kind of hitting a wall with mental health discourses and practices. And a big part of that for me is that, I don't subscribe to this idea that it's just a low levels of serotonin, or that, each individual person has their reasons to be depressed and it's their childhood and everything. I mean, all these definitely are factors, and I don't discount all this analysis, but I think there's a massive elephant in the room whenever depression is being discussed or anxiety, and that's to do with material conditions, that's to do with politics and economics, and it's not lost on me at all, because for me, politics has never been anything that's all that distant. My first confrontation with politics, I grew up in Beirut, and my first experience of politics is the massive car explosion that assassinated the former Prime Minister, Rafiq Hariri, in 2005. I was 11 years old in the playground of my school, and we were playing basketball, and this massive explosion, we all go running inside, and none of us really knew what it was. There was a theory going around that it was that huge weather balloon, or it was, what do you call it, a hot air balloon that exploded. We were kids. But so, thinking about politics in that sense, as like lived experience, not as something that's just something discussed in cafes and in bars and the like, makes the connection between one's mental health and one's experience of politics much more real. Another really good example is that I have been on antidepressants for 3 years now, 2 years, and this is my second time on antidepressants, and I started because at the time, I was still in Lebanon, and there were Israeli jets flying overhead every day, and it was freaking me out. And this came on the back of the port explosion in 2020. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I just want to establish that this podcast is going to be talking a lot about mental health, its political implications and causes, and is going to really reflect my own experiences. I've decided to start recording this now because It's been 80 days of genocide by the Israeli military machine on the people of Gaza, alongside attacks on southern Lebanon, with threats of doing to Beirut what they've done to Gaza. It is really fucking with me. The last 80 days have been some of the worst of my life just to experience. It's absolutely impossible to continue to just live one's life, and I don't think we should be. At the same time, there is only so much I can do, and reckoning with that incompetence, or that impotence, rather, is something that I struggle with, and I know a lot of people are struggling with. On top of this, I think the lack of ability to speak about these things. Twitter is a fucking shit show. Instagram, I mean, aside from just the fact that these are owned by Zionist billionaires, there's also so much censorship, but also it's this anger economy, or this sort of like not hate-filled, but you know what I mean? It's this algorithm that benefits from the shittiest, the hottest takes, and is not something I want to contribute to anymore. I want this to provide me with an outlet to express and talk about my analysis, my experience, to highlight different things that I think aren't discussed as much. I just want this to be a space to talk about how depressed we all are, and the trauma, and everything in between. For the last year, but way more in the last 80 days, I have felt like I've been losing myself. And making this podcast for me is not just a way of like trying to quote unquote recover or get better, but for the time being is a way of trying to salvage myself. I feel like I have a lot to say, and I don't feel like I have a lot of ways of saying it or places to say it. And so ultimately, I've been feeling numb. A couple of days ago, something happened to me that hasn't happened in a while. Nothing that intense, but a story happened. In my life in Beirut, stories happen every day, and stories for me are kind of my lifeblood. I thrive on them, I seek them out, I sometimes create them, sometimes I'm just happy to be observing them, you know, kind of neglecting my own needs just to see where a story plays out. But since moving to Vienna in the last couple of years, I haven't been experiencing that many stories. Stories don't happen that often. The streets aren't as filled. People are just generally colder. They keep to themselves. And so I'm kind of deprived of these stories. But one did occur to me a couple of days ago. And I'd like to share that story because I think actually it's a pretty good one to describe where I'm at emotionally. But also maybe give you a bit of flavor of some of the stories to come, because I do love telling these stories. So this was a couple of days ago, and I'm heading out with a friend who came to visit for the last few days. And we're taking out a small bag of trash, and we're going to go head out to the Arab market. But when I get to the first floor, I notice that the ground floor apartment, the door's open and the person's talking. And this is my 85-year-old neighbor, Helga, who, as the name suggests, is a very cold and bitter and hateful German woman. And, I mean, to be fair, she has been having some health issues lately, and my partner actually has been kind of being very neighborly and helpful. But I just didn't want to sort of get involved in whatever's happening, so I kind of told my friend, like, let's go back upstairs. I want to avoid this. My friend, who's, again, a lot like me, was like, no, I want to see what this famous Helga looks like. So he takes the trash bag and he continues downstairs. And he goes to the backyard, the Hof, as it's called, to throw out the trash. And I just sort of stay there. But then I hear Helga say something like, oh, no, Ginny, her cat. And so it becomes obvious that the cat ran out. And I'm on the first floor. I start noticing that, oh my God, they're going to run up to me. So I run up to the second floor. But then as I get there, I turn around and the cat's just right there. And I kind of feel really guilty. So I pick up the cat, I go downstairs, I give her the cat. And the very first thing she tells me, she looks at me. I haven't seen this woman in like 4 months, but she looks like she's aged 5 years. She's been in and out of hospital, and yeah, and she didn't recognize me. She asked me, "Are you Ayman?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she grabs my hand, she's like, "Come with me," and she drags me into her apartment. I only catch a glimpse of my friend who was there, but I couldn't say anything. And she closed the door. She takes me into her kitchen, and she starts talking to me about her washing machine. And I didn't quite understand. I mean, she's speaking German, and my German is not where it should be, but that's beside the point. But she just kept saying something about the washing machine is not working, and she needs it to work, and I really wasn't picking up. And I told her, "I'm sorry, I don't know how to help you. You need to call like a repairman, a repair person. I apologize." And then she drags me into her bedroom and points to her TV. She's like, "Come help me with this other thing." And the signal's not working. And she asks me if I can help her. And as I'm trying to figure it out, I pick up the remote. She starts telling me about how tired she's been and how sad she is and how lonely she is and how she's thanking me for taking care of the cat while she was in the hospital. And she kind of starts to well up. And it was a bit upsetting, seeing an old lady cry. I'm trying to fix the TV, and I managed to get it to it just wasn't plugged in, the TV box, and I plug it in, and as soon as the signal changes, she grabs my hand and she screams, and then she just starts crying. "Thank you so much. You have no idea how much you've helped me, and I just am so appreciative." And the signal then, the TV picks up, and it just starts blasting out loud like it was like a commercial for the Barbie movie. And she's an old lady, so she's like got the volume up super high. Anyway, she doesn't stop talking. She keeps talking to me, but the TV is there and I can't lower the volume. I don't know how. And she starts telling me about these things, and she's talking about these two sons. At this point, she's speaking English. She does not speak English, but again, she keeps forgetting that I don't speak German. But she's telling me that a reason that she needed the washing machine to work is because tomorrow she's going to meet with her estranged son who, like, backstory, they haven't seen each other in 30 years. It's crazy. Very Austrian. Like, that shit it's impossible in Lebanon. She found out, like, a few months ago that he's still in Vienna, Like, for a mother to not see her child for 30 years and he's still in the same city, impossible. Impossible for it to happen in Lebanon. And it blows my mind that's a real story. But either way, she thanks me, she grabs my hand, and we're just sort of like holding hands, and she's looking into my eyes, and she looks super upset and sad and old. And I hate to say it. I know this makes me seem like a really despicable person, but I just couldn't feel anything. I just felt numb. I've been crying on and off for like the last 80 days, and my heart feels so full. And this is new, what's happening in Gaza, as in the aerial bombardment, the genocide. For this last like few years, it's just been one thing after another coming from my region, and I just feel like numb, and I don't want to. Empathy is something for me that's one of the most important values. So I don't know, it kind of hurts. It's really upsetting that I've come to this point where the situation, I'm in this place and I just can't feel anything. I'm happy to have helped, but anyway, I tell her if you ever need anything, let me know. And she sees me off. I see my friend, and we go, and I tell him about what had happened, and he was a bit annoyed because he was like, "Why did you go? And you left me for 10 minutes and 15 minutes, and then I heard you watching TV together." I found that really funny, but either way, I like that story. It's exactly the stories that I like. It's useless. It's pointless. Stuff happens. It doesn't happen every day. I mean, in Beirut it would happen every day, but you know what I mean? It's unique and strange and filled with metaphors and themes. But ultimately it's absurd and it doesn't matter, and I didn't really learn anything. I mean, I guess in this case I did learn something. All that to say, I hope through this podcast that I can meet other people and in some way break this numbness, because I wasn't always like this and I don't like it. I don't like being numb. I miss feeling and whatever, the goods and the bads. I mean, now it's just bad and meh. And occasionally there's like an up, but like that up gets expended in like an hour or two. So I think that's as close as I can summarize it. I think in terms of the what, this is obviously going to be a blog format. I'm going to be doing most of the talking. But I also hope eventually to be getting some interviews. There's a lot of people that I have these discussions with. I think I know a lot of very interesting, very cool, lefty, active, whatever people that are also super mega fucking depressed. And it always feels frivolous when you're in these situations and in these contexts to be talking about depression and anxiety when there's like mass starvation and violence and oppression. But I feel like it only does more harm not to talk about it, because it just compounds, and we ultimately become less able to confront those issues and to be active and to do what we can if we're not, kind of reminds me of one of these things my mother says over and over again, and I never interrupt her. Every time she tells me, sometimes she's forgotten that she's told me it 100 times. I just let her because I love hearing it every time. It's kind of one of her wisdoms. What do they say in a plane when, loss of cabin pressure and the masks come down? You got to put on your own mask before you help someone else. Because, you need to take care of yourself to be able to take care of someone else. And, I kind of really value that. And I appreciate it every time she tells me. And that's the other point. Stories. This podcast is going to be full of stories. I like telling stories. I'm a trained screenwriter. And I kind of got into that for a reason, but I do find that I don't know, I notice things, I talk about things, I like telling them in fun ways, and I enjoy telling stories that I think are like thematically rich and obviously political in some ways, and I feel like I used to experience them so much in Beirut, and part of the plan of me leaving Beirut, and part of the ways that I had planned to kind of not go insane, is that I think of my time in Beirut as having collected a bunch of stories and not able to write them down because they just kept happening every day mixed with everything else. But so the plan was for me that when I leave, that I would be in a place where I could do something with those stories, that I could write them, that I could make something of them. And that way, being so far away from those stories, I could get closer to them again. So, I envision this to be a kind of a fun place to talk about dark things. Empathetically, of course. And I hope you enjoy this, and I look forward to hearing any and all responses. I'm kind of excited. It's one of the only things that's gotten me excited in the last couple of years, so I hope you're excited by this too, and I'll see you in the next episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. I'm your host, Ayman Makarem, and I've actually got a few things to talk about today. I think it's pretty obvious given what's been happening, and especially the really tragic news from Lebanon yesterday that the Israelis had struck Beirut in a targeted assassination of a Hamas leader in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is particularly upsetting because it's the very first time they've done this openly since at least 2006. It marks a kind of new escalation in the Israeli aggression, not just on Palestinians, but also on Lebanon. But before we get into all that, this is being recorded on the 3rd of January. So it's been an interesting new year. I think I felt something that a lot of people did, which is I didn't know how to respond to Happy New Year wishes, because I don't know. I don't even know what any of it means anymore. But I don't want to lie to people, People ask me, how are you? And I could very easily just say like, oh yeah, all right, But I don't know. I want to live authentically, but also I don't think any of us are doing okay. So I don't know why. I prefer that we don't all just lie to each other, But still, I find myself when people ask, I say I'm not doing well, and they say why, which I find surprising, and especially people from my family who are very aware. And then when I tell them why, they're like, oh, of course, and they know. But I've gotten a lot of different responses to that, and a lot of them are kind of pieces of advice. It's like I'm aware, and obviously I know that me getting depressed about these things don't have like a material benefit for anybody really. But at the same time, I don't think any of us have it figured out. So I find it a bit, I don't know how to deal with piece of advice where it's like, like I don't want to undermine their feelings of confidence about what they're telling me. And it's just a lot of different versions of, there's nothing we can do, so might as well just, bear witness, but not let it affect you that much. And one of my core problems with that is it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only tell yourself that I can't do anything, you're just basically undermining yourself before you even start. And you're giving yourself no ability or time to think about, well, wait, what can I do? Which, again, I don't have any answers, and obviously the way I've been dealing with these things hasn't been great for me. But I think there is still something to the idea of, this is unprecedented. This is a genocide that we are witnessing, that we all feel incredibly incapable of doing anything about, anything meaningful. I don't know, people have been making a lot of comparisons with the Holocaust, with just so many other things. And the question is, if you've ever thought about what you would be doing, you would have done at the time, you're doing it now, This definitely feels like something that, if something is to move us, it would be this, Honestly, I think there's one thing that's constantly been on repeat in my life, which is very vividly and very intimately feeling it. I think a lot of people on the left and a lot of people who are progressive or who are leftist or who whatever have this knee-jerk assumption that when it happens, things will change. Things will only get so bad before they start getting better. And coming from Beirut, which has seen a lot of issues, I've seen it, The biggest example of it is the fucking port explosion. And you'd imagine that that's it, and we all felt it. There was a kind of feeling of impetus just afterwards. And I've discussed this with a lot of people that the first week or two after the explosion were nowhere near as depressing as the second month when things just kind of had to go back to normal, where accountability was really just feeling like an impossibility. And it's been 3 years now, right? And nothing's fucking changed. It's just all gotten worse. The people who are responsible for it are still in charge. The only thing that's changed is that the people who have been protesting it have been intimidated. I think one of the lawyers who was dealing with some of these claims against the state has been facing assassination attempts. I think there was a guy who was in the military. I don't know. Regardless, I think now we've experienced collectively a bunch of versions of that thing vis-a-vis Palestine. So I think October 17 was the first when the Israelis bombed, I think it was Al-Shifa Hospital or Al-Ahli. And there was just this massive feeling across the globe, protests, even at it was midnight at the time when the news was really coming out. There was really that feeling of, no, they've stepped too far. They've done this horrendous massacre and destroyed this hospital. Things are going to change now. And of course, that was 2 months ago. And so many other versions of those things. They use white phosphorus. They're killing journalists at an unprecedented scale. There are just too many things to name. And we keep feeling, I keep feeling, this is it, this has to change. And I think the fact that nothing is changing, that it's just perpetuating and only getting worse, it's kind of just confirming to me something that's one of the most depressing and cynical things that I've been resisting accepting as truth, which is that, I don't know, there's like, we are living in a brutal, brutal world. I mean, who do we complain to, you know? Who's the authority? There's just this constant conclusion that all we have is each other. And when we are so fragmented and disempowered, that feels really depressing. There used to be this feeling wherein, there's sort of this idea of the UN, or even in certain cases like the quote-unquote international community. But I think a lot of that feeling is probably much more dismissed, that feeling of the responsibility of the quote-unquote international community. I think most presently was the crushing of the Syrian revolution. And a lot of the similar things we're seeing now, just taking place on a longer scale and being done by Assad and his sponsors and like Russia. But now we're seeing it by an ally of the US and funded by the US. And it's just, who do we appeal to? There's no one that's going to come save any of us. And so it's quite depressing, and it is difficult not to fall into despair. But at the same time, despair is kind of a form of privilege, which is very difficult to kind of unpack because it doesn't feel very privileged. But compared to those who don't have a choice to fall to despair, who just have to continue because the option isn't despair or hope, it's resisting or death. So what's happening and the expansion of this violence into Lebanon is honestly something that's really scary for me, and has been something obviously that's in the back of a lot of our minds, but I don't know. I also woke up today to news that there was a bomb in Iran at a funeral procession commemorating the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, killing about 100 people, I think. And just now, before I started recording, there was an assassination of, I think, 1 or 3 Hezbollah officials in the south of Lebanon. It's just very clear that the Israelis want to push this further, and what's really scary is no one's going to stop them. Because none of those its that I just talked about were met with anything except ignorance, like a willful ignorance, I mean, fucking Joe Biden is still talking about 40 beheaded babies, so we really live in a world with no leadership, even though I'm very skeptical of the entire concept of leadership in that sense. But scary times. I am nervous, and I'll definitely be talking a lot more about that on this podcast. But before I get too heavy, I want to bring something up that is a bit of a follow-through from the last episode. So, keen listeners to this podcast would remember that I had an incident with my 85-year-old neighbor, Helga. So, updates. There's more that's happened. Although, it is all very tragic. This isn't like hot goss. It's kind of just sad state of affairs, but also a bit difficult. So, New Year's Day, me and my partner are woken by incessant ringing at the doorbell at 9 a.m. And my partner goes to open the door, and this is 9 a.m. We're just completely woken up and it's ringing, ringing, ringing. So it's our neighbor at 9 a.m. And she's yelling in this really nasally Austrian way, where it's just a lot of this and the I could hear what she was saying, and she was saying a lot about the washing machine and was kind of accusing us of breaking her washing machine, which I was super confused by, but also I could tell that she's just rambling. So this goes on for about 10 minutes. My partner closes the door, sort of agrees with them, with the neighbor, that listen, calm down. Let's go talk about this. And I discovered that she got to the point she was sort of threatening to call the police because she was super convinced that we broke into her house and broke her washing machine. And so I wait there for about an hour. I'm still in bed. And when my partner comes back, I discover that our neighbor really is kind of losing grasp of reality. And it's quite scary. She, in the end, would manage to like calm down and sort of apologize. But yeah, that was a pretty upsetting episode. And we thought that was kind of the end of it. But today, we get another rude awakening in the form of the ringing of our intercom. Also at 8 a.m. It's the same neighbor. This time, she locked herself out of not just her apartment, the building. And not just locked herself out, the cat ran out as well. So my partner wakes up, runs down. The reason my partner is the main one to deal with this, for several reasons, but mostly is I don't speak any German. My German is just not at all up to standard to be able to deal with such a, you know what I mean, like an expert level situation. You know, I know how to order food. I don't know how to placate and to calm down a, you know, erratic 85-year-old woman who's clearly going through like mental health issues and like just health issues in general. I think that's more like B2 or C1. Sorry, that was a bad joke. Anyway, so my partner kind of brings her back inside. They call a locksmith. It turns out that she's locked herself out because she's just changed her keys because she's still convinced that people did. She feels insecure in her home. And this is kind of related to that accusation, you know, and that thing about the feeling that, I don't know, someone's out to get her and like breaking her washing machine. So it's just, they talk to another neighbor, also 80 years old. I am surrounded by 80-year-old women. This is my experience of Vienna. And so they wait up there until the locksmith shows up and opens the door. Locksmiths are crazy. This is like I know they do other stuff and they probably get these calls rarely, but they come in, all it is, they just like pop the lock and it opens up immediately. It's like 10 seconds of work, poof, 150 euros. It's happened to me. And it's shocking. It's what? 100, it took a minute. And I get it. There's another joke my mother, it's not even a joke, like she tells it as a story, which is, it's this one where someone sees Picasso in a restaurant and goes up to him and is like, "Oh my God, you're Picasso." And the guy in Picasso's like, "Yeah." So he's like, "Could you draw me something?" And he gives him a napkin. So Picasso kind of like scribbles something, you know, his style. He gives it to the guy, hands it to him. And he tells him, "That'll be $1 million. And the guy says, "What? It just took you 5 seconds." Picasso says, "Well, yes, it took me 5 seconds, but it took me, 5 years or like 50 years to be able to do it in 5 seconds. As a freelancer, I appreciate that. The implications of that story. But yeah, it's one of those silly ones. So anyway, now the other neighbor is apparently they go to the same GP. So she's going to talk to the GP. My neighbor Helga should not be living alone. And it is getting to the point where it's kind of like endangering, herself, her cat. Yeah, I don't know. She needs help. And we definitely can't provide that. I don't know how else to say it. Anyway, hopefully I'll have a new update next time. But I did want to share that story because it's taking up a lot of our thinking. Strangely, much more than we'd have anticipated. If you'd asked me a week ago, what do you plan on doing in the new year? I wouldn't have been saying, taking care of our 85-year-old neighbor, which I should mention because I realized that I didn't in the last episode. So it made me seem much worse than if I had mentioned. But my first interaction with this person, with Helga, was sitting in the garden. It's a long story, but essentially she yelled at me. She screamed at me. And I had no idea what was going on. And apparently she has some beef with the other neighbor. And so she was like, but she screamed. I haven't had someone scream at me in a very long time, probably since I was a child. And she just, das ist meine Garten. That's my garden is basically what she's saying, even though it's like a communal garden. And I wasn't doing anything, I was just sitting. But anyway, all that to say, we got off on the wrong foot, but also she just seems like she's a difficult person in general. So yeah, that's another Helga update. I hope that doesn't start becoming a kind of series, but it is what it is. I mean, if it isn't obvious, I am actually quite... It sounds so weird, but I'm a bit glad that something like this is happening because there's not much going on in my life, and it kind of sort of something else to talk about, because otherwise everything is just incredibly doom and gloom and violence and impotence. I think there's, on top of the fact that these things are happening and there's some of the most atrocious and gut-wrenching things that we're witnessing and in many cases experiencing, it's nice to have a kind of other narratives, let's say. See, the reason that this attack on Beirut is so terrifying, not just that it signals, obviously, a desire by the Israelis to, expand their war effort. I think it is as simple as that they want to cross all these red lines that all these other groups, that Hezbollah, that Iran have set, and intentionally crossing it and just, pushing for an escalation, pushing for a retaliation that they know they have support to double down on. And that's really fucking scary. And for me personally, obviously Beirut is my home. My whole family is there. All my friends are there. It's my city. Is a big, big, big part of why I even left Beirut to begin with 2 years ago, is because something like this was inevitable. That I felt it in my bones, that I'd been worried of a new Israeli war for a couple of years before I eventually left, culminating in, intense anxiety attacks, especially, when I would literally hear and feel the Israeli jets. There's one incident that is not really spoken about, and it's sort of one of those things that if we lived in a sane world, this would merit just as much of a response as anything else. But on December 2020, it's actually a weird story. I'm sitting in my bedroom on the computer, and I hear this rumbling. And I go to the window, and I open the window, and I stick my head outside. And I'm noticing it's coming from the parking lot right outside my place. And it's these two guys on a skateboard, on the gravel. So it's making this brrr noise. And as I heard them kind of falling and trying new things, they're speaking in an American accent, that they were these two white guys that are just damn man, try to do I used to know skateboarding terms. A snooki? No, that's not anything. An oogie? I'm just making things up, whatever. A sort of round off, And I kind of, after about 5 minutes of this rumbling and them talking to each other, I kind of yelled at them. In this very it's 10 p.m. go home whitey. I don't know. I wasn't like that, but it was funny for me. Anyway, close the window, go back to my computer. And about 10 minutes later, I hear a similar rumbling. And when I open the window, I notice that it's not coming from downstairs, not coming from the parking lot. It's coming from above, and it's much louder. And it starts getting really loud, and not just a rumbling, I start feeling it. And it starts shaking the ground a bit. And it's at about that point that I see 1, 2, and eventually 5 lights in the sky. And it became quite clear that these are either jets or rockets. And in that moment, after the port explosion, where the trauma has made me so perceptive to the endless possibilities, that anything could happen, I thought they were nukes, and I don't think I'm crazy for having thought that. And I rush in, I wake up my flatmate at the time, and go back, and we see this, and they just sort of keep going northwards. And the sound subsides, and it's kind of just, okay, we're not the targets. And I threw up, which is, to me, the most intense reaction that I have in these moments of anxiety. It's the vomiting. This is when I literally just cannot handle the situation. And I think my body can't handle it, and I just sort of project, literally, project out my emotions. That was the day I decided to leave, that I'm going to start preparing to leave. And it took me 6 months, but that was the moment. So what ended up happening is we discovered that this was an attack on Ladi, or Latakia. But anyway, it was an Israeli attack on Syria, and they used our airspace to shoot their missiles. So it would go undetected by Syrian air defense. And so, since it wasn't us that was a target of this, it just didn't make the news, and it wasn't anything. It was only something for those that experienced it. But even for those that experienced it, it doesn't hold as intensely as like actual attacks or the port explosion or all the other things that are sort of going wrong in the country and happening. But I really remember it, and it was one of the most painful things. And the Israeli jets that would keep showing up afterwards, just kind of as like it's terrorism. There's really no other term for it. It's just terrorizing an entire civilian population. And all they can say is like, oh yeah, well, it's Hezbollah and whatever. But it's like, there's 2 million people. And also, fuck you. Like, I don't know, whatever. So, yeah. So what's sort of happening is my worst nightmare. And I really just, I really don't know what to think about it. It's painful, but it's just this feeling of impotence that there's really just nothing I can do about it from here. But even if I was there, and I don't know what anybody can do about it, because who's going to stop them? Like, what authority exists? And if they're challenging at like a military level, they're demanding a military response. And the only group that has any military capabilities of challenging that is Hezbollah. And, not the biggest fan, but like the Lebanese army is flaccid as it's nothing. But also they're complicit, or rather have just been fine with, letting the South be bombed. And they've just never been the actual ones to protect Lebanese against Israeli aggression. So it just really feels scary. And I obviously recognize my privilege being in Vienna talking about these things, but that doesn't really make any difference. I think there's one thing which I've been thinking a lot about, and I found myself doing, which is one of the only things that people seem to be kind of moved to point out in moments like this. And I think this actually is an expression of the very impotence that I was just talking about, is in seeing the kind of hypocrisy in Western media. And I found myself yesterday after the assassination, like I think a lot of us have been doing, checking what is the BBC saying, how's the New York Times, how's Fox News reporting this. And of course, all of them say this thing of like Dahia is a Hezbollah stronghold and an attack on a Hezbollah stronghold. And that this was like just a targeted assassination, and it was sort of legitimate as they frame it. And there's a lot of people that do this thing where they post the New York Times headline and then correct it, removing the honestly dehumanizing passive language, but also correcting some of these things, like the BBC's obsession with this, Hamas-run health ministry, which is just a ridiculous thing to say. You never say the British-run NHS or the Lebanese, it just is the Palestinian health ministry in Gaza. But like many people are pointing out, it's a form of manufacturing consent, because then you associate everything to this boogeyman that we've already established is a terror group, which interestingly, the BBC don't call, like not like the New York Times or CNN, like they just call it a terror group. And again, that's also part of this like ideological manufacturing of consent, because it makes it out to be a legitimate target, even though these are civilian residential areas, and this was rush hour. I'm losing the feeling of like what we can do. And a lot of the things I do see people doing, I'm obviously not going to tell them not to do it, because I don't know, that would be ridiculous and cynical. But at the same time, I find myself doing it and then checking myself and wondering, what is the point? what do we really gain from constantly demonstrating that these media organizations that are situated within empire are complicit and reflect the desires and the ideologies of said empire? I don't know. I think there's definitely something to it, but at the same time, it just really demonstrates how little power we have, and, in this sense, how few sources we have. We don't have our own version of the New York Times, and we don't have the own reach and the own institutional power of all these things, of the Guardian, of the BBC. Definitely this podcast is one way for me to try to, in my own way, fix that balance, to say what I want to say, not just as a fix of what other people are saying, and other people as in people who are like directly complicit in genocide, like the New York Times. So yeah, I don't know. That's what's been weighing on my mind, and I think we're really going to be tense for the next week as we see what Hezbollah's going to do, what Iran's going to do, what Israel has planned next, and what the Americans are going to do. And I don't know, I'm just worried, very angry. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is a shift, and maybe this time it will be it. Or maybe it's just another delusion. Who knows? I guess we just have to wait to find out. And on that note, I think I'm going to wrap it up. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. And if you enjoy this episode, and if you enjoy this podcast is being supported and hosted by the Fire These Times. And so if you'd like to support this project and the Fire These Times in general, head out to their Patreon, where you can support for as little as $5 a month. And one last thing, actually, if you're listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform, please leave it a review. It really helps. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next week. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Ayman Makarem. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a few things. For those that have been following the last two episodes, there is another Helga update. For everybody else, I will be talking a bit about the Golden Globes. Not in terms of who won what or what happened to who, or I don't care. It's the fact that it happened, and it's kind of an extreme example of something that I think a lot of us are feeling, but it's very hard to put into words, which is this feeling of increasingly separate planes of existence, I didn't know that the Golden Globes happened this weekend, but when I discovered, it was just anything that's being written about it or anything that I've seen of it, it's all incredibly gauche and crass, and it feels really disgusting, given the context that the United States is completely funding and supporting and backing diplomatically and militarily and in all ways an ongoing genocide. It's been 95 days. Before I get into all of that, I wanted to talk a little bit about something I've been experiencing, which is I have been feeling really, really depressed and really sad and finding myself wanting to cry. I can't. And I realized that since I've moved here, since I've left Lebanon, I've lost access to the places and the spaces and the relationships that would allow me to essentially cry, to let out some of these feelings that have just been bottling up for the last few months, in reality for the last few years. I talked to a friend of mine. They gave me a little piece of advice that I really appreciated. They said, have you tried listening to some music? And the reason this kind of touched me is because I have noticed that I don't listen to music as much as I used to. And music was always a kind of connector for me, a way of relating, of being a bit sort of introspective. It may sound a bit silly, but I have this sort of routine. Whenever anybody close to me passes, I would put on a record, which is just this sort of violin concerto by Tchaikovsky. And it's a great performance, but I don't know, it gets me sobbing. It's a beautiful piece, and it has this weird hopefulness that's kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of feeling of a conflict between life and the inevitability of death that I kind of read into that particular piece. But more so than anything else, it just really gets me, it opens me up, and I'm able to cry. So when I went back to Beirut, I actually did bring back a bunch of my records. That's another thing that I feel separated from, which was my record collection. And so I've been very hesitant about this over the last few years, but I'm going to buy a new record player. It's going to be a bit of money, but I think I've done without it for too long, and it's done me no good, and I miss it. And it's one of those things that I feel disconnected from, that I can reconnect with. So I'm going to do that. I kind of realized some of these things in therapy. And that's another thing that I wanted to talk about, is that I'm not going to therapy anymore. And I'm looking for a new therapist. So if anyone knows anyone good, I'm even considering online therapists, because the selection seems pretty slim here in Vienna, once you discount all the non-English speakers. I'm left with just a bunch of white people that I can't really relate with. My last therapist, actually, the one that I've basically just kind of broken up with, was this white guy from Germany. He was nice enough. He was Gestalt, which is this German school of psychotherapy, which is basically summed up with the phrase, the here and now. And I went to him for about 1.5 years, but I don't know, I think towards the end it started becoming really clear and apparent that I couldn't actually relate to him and he couldn't relate to me. And I found it really frustrating, because whenever I would talk politics, or you know what I mean, like lived experience politics or whatever's going on back home, it's been the last 2 years and Lebanon has just continuously deteriorated economically and politically. He would kind of just be listening and whatever. But then as soon as I stop, he would just ask me something like, what do you feel in your body right now? It just felt kind of dismissive. There was ultimately this feeling that even though, yes, I do have a tendency to over-intellectualize things and not pay enough attention to my emotions, in certain cases, I don't know. The political thing isn't just a distraction. Like, it is the issue that I'm working through, that I'm trying to make sense of. So to have this white guy basically tell me that, like, politics isn't a part of it, it feels shitty, but it also just kind of replicates the exact problem, one of the main problems I've been having the last 2 years here in Europe, which is that's basically everybody. Everybody, as in white Europeans, who I'm surrounded by, really have this tendency to think that politics is always just something that happens over there. There's this deep ingrained feeling wherein politics is just something to be discussed and not something that's lived and not something that is completely tied to people's actual lives. And so what I found myself doing with this therapist is just kind of talking to him as a white person. I had this huge hesitancy to talk about anything because I don't want to be seen through the white gaze, you know what I mean? But when I realized that for 2 years I've been talking about, my issues being surrounded by white people, talking to a white person about this, I started asking him some questions, and it was still difficult, and I honestly just did not feel safe in the end. And he couldn't really assure me that I felt safe. I heard a horrible, horrible story from, I think, Denmark, of a Palestinian man whose family was killed in Gaza. And he had said to the therapist that, in his grief, he said he wishes he could martyr himself so he could be with his family. And this white therapist calls the cops because to her, she, in her white mind, can only understand the concept of martyrdom in this very orientalized, very war on terror understanding of it, where it's, he wants to do a terrorist act. It also just goes to show how little they understand about us and our language and our culture, and how we're kind of all potential threats. We're all suspect, as Arabs. And that's kind of been a new reality. And I just, towards the end, the last time I saw this therapist was about 2 months ago. And yeah, I'm not going back to him. I think it's the right choice, but in lieu of therapy, I think I'm basically doing the meme. Men will literally start a podcast instead of going to therapy. But yeah, I don't think I'm sublimating. I think I'm trying to actually do what I would have done had I had a proper therapist. I'm still looking. The funny thing that I realized at the time was that I stayed with him for so long because I had an imaginary therapist in my head, and she was kind of like a straw person who everything that I didn't like about him, I would imagine that she would know, she would be better. So, and I kind of imagine her as being an Arab, a cool kind of, I don't know, psychoanalysis mixed with whatever, anti-capitalist, I don't know. Just like a cool therapist, POC gal. And so she wouldn't dismiss me talking about politics. She would, quote unquote, get it. And what's really funny about that is I have a Syrian friend in the US who went to a therapist. It was sort of a new experience for them. And the therapist, although an immigrant woman from South Asia, she didn't get it. She was the opposite of this imaginary therapist that I had in my mind. She did the exact same thing. She sort of was super dismissive and it was like, can you stop talking about war? And I don't know, the problem, is it not probably more about your childhood or whatever? So imagine telling a Syrian person I don't think we should be talking about war. That doesn't seem like the real problem here. And so, yeah, for me, therapy is a bit of a shit show, and still haven't found the therapist, but I'm looking. So, yeah. So, Helga update. This is the moment y'all have been waiting for. For keen listeners of the show, you'll already know, but for those that haven't listened to the last 2 episodes, Helga is my 82-year-old neighbor who... Okay, it's actually quite sad. I'm sorry to sound a bit chipper, but basically she's kind of been harassing us because she's going through basically numerous health and mental health crises. She rang our doorbell on New Year's Day at 9 a.m. and our intercom on the 3rd of January at 8 a.m. The first time, she was accusing us, me and my partner, of breaking into her apartment and breaking her washing machine, which just is was very bizarre to hear. And on the 3rd, because she'd locked herself out of her apartment, because she had just changed the keys, because she was super convinced that we did break into her apartment and break her washing machine. So, continuation of this saga happens on January 6th, when at 9 a.m. we're woken up from the doorbell, and my partner opens up the door, and it's the cops. She called the cops on us. She actually so believes that my partner broke into her apartment. Again, and this is someone who we've only had decent to good relations with. We were really helpful when she was in hospital. We took care of her cat. There's been a lot. But she called the cops. And it was fine. Nothing's gonna happen. The cop she was really understanding. She said something really funny, actually, when my partner opened the door. She said, I didn't actually think you were real, because it's very clear that Helga is making stuff up. So, yeah, I don't know, my partner went down and dealt with the whole situation. And basically, again, the cops knew what was going on, they get it. And again, really sad fact, they said that they've been getting a lot of calls like this, and it happens usually around this time of year, because older people in Vienna, not as much family. Christmas time, so there's like a lot of family-oriented stuff, and they get even sadder. And honestly, there's so much about the situation that's like really depressing. But she called the cops on us. That's like an escalation. And yeah, but also we can't really blame her because she's not in control of her faculties, clearly. Yeah, so cops gave us a kind of number to call, like, to contact the state, essentially, and like the health services, because, yeah, since she has no family that's like willing or able to take care of her, we've had to kind of talk to whatever state agency and be like, there's this person who's kind of going through numerous crises and has been essentially kind of lashing out at us as a result of it, and we don't know what to do, so we're going to wait to see what happens. It's been very weird. It's not how I thought this year would start, and it's just kind of been taking a lot out of us. But that's the Helga update. I really hope this doesn't become a series, because it feels a bit weird to kind of milk this situation for content. But anyway, what I really want to talk about is the Golden Globes. I didn't know that they were going to happen this weekend. Honestly, awards and stuff like this always catch me by surprise. On a normal year, I usually just don't care, because, I don't know, all these award ceremonies are basically just rich white people congratulating themselves for mostly really mediocre output. But yeah, but right now, like, as the genocide is still unfolding, as massacres are happening every day, as people across the United States are protesting, Joe Biden's speech the other day was kind of heckled. There were protesters that disrupted his speech at a church. They're blocking roads. There are people that are still blocking like ports and stopping weapons, munitions from heading to Israel. They're protesting all over. And not just in the US, obviously, but just since the Golden Globes happens in the US, and the US is like the main, like, it's not just a sponsor. I think people should stop calling it like a US sponsored thing. It is the US and Israel doing this. And so to see all these incredibly wealthy people, these celebrities who are kind of modern day lower aristocracy, in lieu of the princes and the heirs and the whatever and the dukes, we have Midrishu, Brad Pitt and whatever, sort of just living it up and having fun. And then obviously all these articles about, oh, did Taylor Swift get whatever? And look at this photo of Billie Eilish. And it's so fucked up. I don't know how to keep reality together. I think that sums up what I'm trying to describe. I don't know how to keep all the pieces of reality together. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. How can these people do this? And the machinery of essentially of capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism just goes on unhindered. There was maybe like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks where people, content creators and writers and whatever, were kind of more hesitant to just do anything. And now it's just, you open Instagram and Twitter and people are just back to making their bullshit content as though there's nothing going on. And it's kind of similar to the feeling of how difficult it is and alienating it is to see people just going on with their lives and kind of being unaffected. And as though this is kind of normal, oh, this type of shit happens all the time. And no, it doesn't. This is a genocide. Like, when we say genocide, it is not just a legal term. It is, I think, an expression of the worst thing that can be done, that humans can do to other humans. I don't know what else, what's stronger than genocide. I don't think it exists, and that's what we're describing. And so seeing, footage daily and kind of understanding, at least trying to, because I think it's really impossible to truly grasp what is happening in Gaza, but trying to, and then seeing that the Golden Globes happened, and then seeing whatever content that's coming out from it. And even the thing that's a bit nice, that some people are commenting as a good thing, but honestly I think is not, and I think it's just a horrendous thing, which is Rami, the guy who made the show Rami, I think is the only person that said anything about Palestine. And it was kind of a bit of a joke. He kind of weaved it into a question about Calvin Klein. And he said, well, we all want two things. We want a ceasefire, and we want this person to stop making videos. And it was kind of a bit of a joke. I think that's actually really dangerous, and I think more people should call this out. And I saw one person describe it as the memification of genocide. And that's actually been an Israeli tactic. You know, you have, it's absurd. You have like people who are in the IDF, who are in the genocidal army, enacting the genocide right now, called waifu. And she's kind of cute and whatever, and she's in the whole uniform, but she's posting thirst trap content on TikTok while she's doing a fucking genocide. I just don't know how we can all stay sane. And I do think it's kind of this old, who was it? Eric Fromm, you know, a sane society. We do live in an insane society. And maintaining this kind of semblance of sanity, I think, is part of the problem, part of the delusion. But yeah, it's obviously a scary leap to kind of accept and reckon with the contradictions that we're seeing around us, because it makes us feel insane. But in reality is insane. The situation is insane. And I think there's this huge feeling of wanting things to go back to normal, but I think that's part of the problem. I think we do need to be much more critical of what normality is and what amount and types of violence are accepted under our conception of just normal living, you know, of normality. Obviously, this discussion, this discourse has existed for a very long time, but more recently, like COVID, so like, oh, I just want to go back to normal, is basically saying like, oh, whatever, I don't care if older people die or immunocompromised people die. I want to go have sushi. Actually, this brings up a really good comparison. Sorry to call my own comparison good, but I think it is pretty good. Do you remember, maybe like the second or third lockdown, you know, the more miserable ones, when I think it was like Kim Kardashian took her whole family and they went to an island and she made this post about it where it's like, oh, we worked so hard and we did whatever. And she got a lot of shit for it because it's like the contrast was so apparent. All of us across, like in so many places across the world, were stuck at home, miserable, scared to go outside, you know, avoiding the plague. And here is Kim Kardashian, this whatever rich bougie ass person, taking her whole family on a big vacation. And so that contrast to the feeling of living in our situation in lockdown and not sure about how we're going to get paid, not sure about, you know, if anybody in our family or anything's going to get seriously ill or die. She's going off and doing this stuff. And there were other people like her, but I noticed that a lot of people really felt that contrast. You know, it was a, as they say, a let them eat cake moment. But I think what's happening now is that exact same thing, but it's not just one woman. It's like an industry. It's like a class. It's a race. It's a whatever. It's rich white people or middle class whatever, or people in the West. It's really difficult. And I feel I don't know how to bridge those gaps. And oftentimes what happens, and this is what happened with my therapist, to bring it back to that, is when I would bring up that there is a distance between him and that distance is called whiteness, he would tell me that I'm putting a barrier between us and he's trying to reach across that barrier. And I thought that was bullshit, because actually I think I'm not creating the barrier. I'm just calling attention to it. And so that's, I think, a good summary of how I've been feeling and thinking whenever I see Golden Globe shit, or I don't know, anybody who has the privilege not to, still deciding to live their life, to not be affected by this, by throwing their hands up or perpetuating whatever. And I mean, this is the Golden Globes. I mean, a lot of these people are Zionist. A lot of these people are, like, explicitly, and I mean, this is Hollywood, which is very attached to American empire and American militarism and It's just, this brings up a whole other issue, which is how can we still enjoy art and music and TV shows where, like, fuck, we've got to be super fucking skeptical all the time. I brought up the other day that I discovered like a few years ago that Bob Dylan, who was at the time my favorite musician, is a hardcore Zionist. It's true. Look up the song Neighborhood Bully, written during the like Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So Is that a conversation of art versus artist? Or is it a conversation of how to remain sane in an insane world? These are all questions that I'll still be thinking about for a very long time. But until then, this has been another episode of Politically Depressed, which is supported by the Fire These Times, which is a media ecosystem from and for the periphery. If you want to support this project or the bigger project, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes, and even a $5 a month helps this project grow and would be greatly appreciated. And one last thing, if you're listening to this on Spotify or on Apple Podcast, please leave it a review, a 5-star rating. It really helps us overcome the shitty algorithm. So that's all for me, and I'll see you next week. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. I'm your host, Ayman Makarem. So before we start today's episode, I want to give a brief shout out to everyone who's reached out over the last few weeks to say how much they've enjoyed this podcast or how much they appreciate it. It honestly means so much to me. I love getting these messages, and I just want to send a message of love and appreciation back to everybody who's listened to the last few episodes and who's listening right now, hopefully. I mention this especially because I am, I think right now, feeling the hump of podcasting, of especially something so personal and intense as this. I'm kind of over that initial excitement of starting something new and, now envisioning the kind of longue durée of this podcast. And it's a bit daunting. Because, the things, as you can tell, the things I'll be covering and talking about are very personal, are very difficult. So it's nice to know that there are other people out there listening, and it's not just me and this microphone. But I think I already jumped the gun a bit by mentioning the lack of comprehension and ability to comprehend what the fuck is happening in Gaza. It's unbelievable. And it's impossible to really wrap my head around it, let alone my heart or whatever. It's been 102 days, and the last 5 days there's been no internet in the Gaza Strip, and there's a silence. There's a silence because of the internet blackout. There's a silence because 109 journalists have already been killed by the Israelis, and the few things we are getting and seeing are horrendous and gut-wrenching. I am still thinking about what I mentioned in the last episode about how can I still feel sane in this incredibly insane world. And I think I have a bit more to say about that, which I will in this episode. But before I get into all that, there is one new Helga update that actually I just received from my partner just a few minutes before recording, which is that she's back in hospital, which is very sad. My partner and another neighbor, also another old 85-year-old woman, Austrian, went down to her apartment to take care of the cat, to feed the cat, who obviously is not having a very good time. And it's a bit depressing. It's, coming towards the end, and so, I don't know. She's 82 years old. She's a heavy, heavy smoker. And so, no idea. There's one depressing detail which mentioning it feels a bit weird, but I guess I will, is that my partner found a bunch of notes she had written. She'd essentially scattered her last will and testament on a bunch of Post-it notes throughout her apartment, which is just really depressing. But I don't know. I'm worried, but ultimately, yeah, I really don't know how to deal with death and dying. It's kind of why this story has been so difficult for me to think or talk about or relate to. There's definitely a part of the numbness that I described in the first episode, and that's definitely a big part of it. And the numbness that comes from having borne witness for 100 days to a genocide of the Palestinians. But also just the very sheer fact of death and dying. I can't really, it's sort of, I hit a wall. The sort of one of the fundamental stories of my life is kind of like the backstory, or what some therapists call the core wound, I guess, is I remember when I was about, I think, 8 or 10 years old, I dreamt that I fell off a building and I hit the ground and I died. And in the dream, I died. I experienced the kind of blackness. And for context, I come from a Druze family. If you don't know about the Druze, Google it. It's fascinating. For those that don't know anything about it, you're in for a trip. But for those that do know, we believe in reincarnation, but more so we don't really believe in anything. Or rather, basically it was very easy for my parents to basically raise me atheist, and I was essentially atheist. I never really had a strong conception of God or of heaven or of hell or of the afterlife or anything. And so when I died in that dream, I died the kind of blackness, nothingness, And I woke up 5 seconds later, 10 seconds after experiencing death, quote unquote. So I woke up crying, and my mother, who was in the room, long story, we were in between moves, so we're staying at my grandparents' place, and we were both sleeping in the same room with my brother in the other bed. This isn't part of the story. The point is, I wake up crying, my mother takes me into the living room, calms me down, and the first thing I asked her when I was able to speak, and it's a very interesting question by its framing, because I knew what I wanted her to answer, and I framed the question in such a way that I knew what I wanted her to answer. And I asked her, am I going to die? And my mother, in all her wisdom, listen, I've been through this story and back. My mother is raised us in a very laissez-faire kind of, I don't want to lie to them or to whatever. She said to me, of course, Habib, everybody is going to die. I'm going to die, you're going to die, your brother, your father. But at that point, my brain stopped. And essentially, I've been stuck in that moment ever since. I just do not want to die, and I do not want to think about it or think about other people dying. And yeah, obviously, in the years of therapy that I've been in, I've confronted this core memory, but also this implications. But I've obviously never really been able to come to terms with accepting death as just a reality and an inevitability. And so, yeah, this story of Helga and what's sort of happening to her, it's inevitable. So it's been very upsetting. But that's all I have to say about that. And I'm worried about what the next update will be. But yeah, this has turned into a kind of interesting, potentially farcical story into just a purely sad story. There's really not much more to say about it. Anyway, there is one thing that I have been thinking a lot about, which is I think it's really important for everybody anywhere to not be looking away from what's happening in Gaza. I want to leave a footnote here actually, because I've noticed that I've been exclusively talking about Palestine in this podcast, and it kind of sounds like the only issue that I see in the world, is Palestine, but obviously Palestine is an amalgam of a lot of things. It is also in an incredibly accelerated state at the moment, as in the devastation and the misery and the murder. It's genocide. And like I said in the last episode, genocide not just as a legal term, but as in the worst thing that can be inflicted onto a population. And we are just witnessing it, and every day, and it's just getting worse and worse. But I do want to mention that a lot of the pain that I've been feeling and a lot of the feelings of despair that I'm trying to resist is coming from what's happening in Gaza. It's coming from the war in Sudan, which is actually getting worse as the RSF is gaining more territory and just actually capturing cities. I won't go into detail. I'll probably talk more about it in a later episode. It's the continued misery of everyday people in Syria, the bombardment in the north of Syria by the Assad regime, the economic collapse in Lebanon. And so all these things are really weighing heavily. But at the moment, yes, it's undeniable that Gaza is first and foremost on my mind. And so one thing that's really been difficult about witnessing everything that's happening in Gaza is that we're seeing so much of this on Twitter and on Instagram. And not only are these two platforms like some of the worst, let's say, curators or the worst ways to be witnessing a genocide. I'm sure I've mentioned this earlier, just the very fact of it's just content. And then you scroll down and it's something completely random and stupid and just white people doing their bullshit. And then the next thing is some Zionist justifying the unjustifiable. But also is because of this concept of doom scrolling, right? And this has existed for a few years now, and it's just this sort of inebriated state that people find themselves in, that I found myself in numerous times, of just scrolling endlessly. And I've analyzed this, and a part of it is there's this dual feeling of thinking that if you scroll far enough, you'll find the answer. You'll find the secret. You'll find the one post that's like, don't worry, everything is actually going to be fine. Or you're scrolling until you find the post where it's like, oh, this is it. It's all over. Pack up your bags. We're all going to die. And obviously neither of those posts exist. But I find that a very problematic way of framing what's happening at the moment and the use of social media to listen to what Palestinians want us to be listening to hear what they're saying and seeing what they want to show us. So I think oftentimes I find myself watching something, having watched something, or just generally depressed and talking to people. And I get a response that I've gotten a lot, which is just stop looking at the news. There's nothing you can do about it. You're just depressing yourself. It's almost masochistic. And I find that very problematic, and it doesn't sit well with me, because if I were to just not look at Twitter or Instagram or read the news, I functionally feel like I am silencing the very Palestinians, the Syrians, the marginalized communities around the world who are reliant on these platforms to get their message out, you know? I'm basically saying, no, I don't want to listen to what you have to say. An extreme example of this is that yesterday I watched a really horrible video which is being circulated. And this is quite distressing, so bear yourself. It's a video in full graphic detail of a man, a doctor, performing an amputation of his daughter's right leg on the dining room table of their living room without anesthesia, without any proper tools or anything. And it was horrific, and I couldn't watch the whole thing, but I couldn't not watch it because I know that that family posted that video wanting the world to see it. It's not some random video on Live Leak of horrendous gore, which is just for the amusement of like disgusting, sadistic people or whatever. This is a message that this family wants us to see, and it's horrible. But I'm still reminded of that feeling of I shouldn't look away, you know? That the reason a lot of people are able to just go about their lives as normal is because they're not seeing this. Is because they are kind of living in a delusional, a different plane, kind of, you know, like all the white people in Europe. And they are essentially ignoring and being part of the silencing and erasure of Palestinian voices. And so there's a weird duality to all this because at one hand, I hate Twitter, I hate Instagram. These are obviously, I've said this before, owned by Zionist billionaires, and the algorithm is designed to create frustration. Is obviously there's shadow banning, there's a censoring in the platforms themselves directly of some of these pages, but it's all we have. It's all they have, you know, like even without internet, still using some of these eSIMs, and it's their way of sending out these pleas to the rest of the world. And so being on Twitter and Instagram feels necessary and feels like a duty, because it feels like otherwise we'll just be looking away and ignoring those pleas and insisting on continuing to function within a world which essentially, once it boils down, is premised on the death and erasure and violence of Palestinians, but also of so many other communities in the global south. And that's only going to get worse. I'm not saying that if people watch these videos, they're instantly going to become activists and engaged in politics and I don't know what. I have no idea what's going to get people to move. I actually don't even believe in that anymore. It's part of the reason why I'm so fucking depressed, because like I said, there have been so many moments, there are so many it's where I'm like, this is the moment that, you know, people say it can only get so bad before it gets better, and it just keeps getting worse. Like there is no point wherein it's like there's a turning point, and so that's been really difficult to sit with. But at the same time, I definitely do want to say that there is a distinction between what is known as doom scrolling and listening to what Palestinians are saying and watching what they want us to see and experiencing for even a brief moment the misery that they are, in hopes that that will elicit some reaction within us. Us as in all the people not under the bombs at the moment, but especially people in positions of privilege who are citizens of these countries that are supporting and sponsoring this ongoing genocide. And so oftentimes, the only thing that's really stopping me from hitting an actual wall of despair is not in listening to the people telling me not to look at the news and not to follow what's happening, or to, again, I don't want to decontextualize. These are people's lives. These are actual people who are trying to reach the world. It's not just events and news and whatever. It's, at the moment, you know, it's people like Bisan and Montez and just so many journalists and so many activists and so many just random people who are posting things in hopes of changing their situation. It's so painful, but at the same time, it's so necessary to connect constantly with the human level. And that means letting these things affect me. That means watching these videos. That means listening to Bisan speak every day as though she's speaking to me, and allowing myself to feel the painful emotions that it elicits. It's impossible to think that a genocide would happen in Palestine, that my country would be thrown into war, that all these horrible things will happen, and that I'm not going to be affected by it, and that I can delineate the exact ways that it's going to affect me. We have no idea how this is going to affect us. I have absolutely no idea how this is going to affect people in Gaza and in Palestine, and where this is going and what's the quote-unquote day after. Because again, the day after is such a fucking colonial term. There is no day after. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, is another one of these terms that's so white. You know, so much of this research is about soldiers that go to countries, and again, mostly colonial and imperialist soldiers that come back to normality and cannot function. But for Palestinians, for people in the region, for Syrians, for Lebanese, and there is no after. This is a constant state of humiliation, of oppression, of violence, of unsuredness. So to circle back to it, the main thing that is stopping me from falling into despair is the fact that these exact people are not falling into despair. That it feels like such a place of privilege for me to say that I I'm too sad to do anything about this, when there are so many people in Gaza. Honestly, at the moment, I'm thinking a lot about the journalist Wa'il al-Dahdouh, known as Abu Hamza, who has had so many members of his family murdered, targeted by the Israeli state, by the Israeli army. And he just kept doing his job, and he kept reporting. And then a week ago, they killed his son, who's also a journalist, Hamza al-Dahdouh. And he said something that honestly has kind of been stuck with me ever since. He said this at his son's funeral. He said, "These tears make us different from our enemy, because we are full of humanity, and they are full of bloodthirst and hatred. We cry and shed tears, but they are tears of humanity, tears of generosity and bravery, not tears of fear and humiliation." I don't know. I think that really addresses just so much of the feelings that I've been thinking about, that I think that quote makes it clear that my question last week about remaining sane in an insane world might actually be a bit more coherent if it's reframed. I think it's not about being sane in an insane world, but about being humane in an inhumane world. And witnessing what we're witnessing and accepting it as reality, to remain humane, we become a bit insane. And the alternative is this kind of numbness, which I think is horrible. And to feel this numbness is to allow the imperialist, the Zionist, a victory over our very capacity to feel, to be human. If, this is why people talk about joy as resistance. This is why people talk about healing as a form of resistance, because the Israelis do not just want to kill as many Palestinians as they can, to ethnically cleanse, to clear populations. They want to destroy their spirit, and also the spirit of anyone who stands in solidarity with them. Despair is a function of colonialism. Like, it is something that benefits it. It benefits capitalism as well. It benefits all these shitty power structures that we want to overthrow, that we have to overthrow. Otherwise, we are all doomed. Sorry, so I got a bit intense there. I think you can tell this has been something that I've been thinking a lot about, but also been very conflicted with. And I'm really glad I got that off my chest. I hope I was coherent. I would love to hear your thoughts about that, actually. If you've been experiencing that same issue between following the news, actually listening to Palestinians, what people say, listen to marginalized voices, etc., and versus this concept of doom scrolling, how it's been affecting you, and what you've been doing about it, because I honestly, part of my answers these days of what am I doing about it is this. And it's kind of helping me frame stuff. But I would love to hear from other people what they're doing and what's working for them or what's not working for them. I would love to hear any responses to any of the things that I've mentioned. I have noticed that this podcast is going to start getting, as things get worse, more and more personal and more, let's say, in-depth. And I look forward to it, and I hope you are too. So I think that about wraps things up. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. This podcast is supported by the Fire These Times, a media ecosystem from and for the periphery. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. You can do so by heading out to patreon.com/thefirethesetimes and make a donation of as little as $5 a month. And if you're not able to, you can still support this podcast by telling your friends about it or by leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. So that's it for me. I'll see you all next week.